viewers, we are back now. Today I will go MEG 15 comparative literature theory and practice discussion. You can go through my previous videos of MEG 6 and CT 01, 02, 03, 04. Already I have discussed in my previous videos all about IGNOU assignments and various question answers. And today we will go MEG 15 comparative literature theory and practice. So here it is block 3 which I will discuss. It is an important part of exam point of view and also is in your NET exam also, NET and SET exam also. Okay, so please like, share and subscribe my videos and push the bell icon for my future videos. Okay, so MEG 15 comparative literature theory and practice we will go. Here it is block 3. So what does the video comprises? That is the comparative Indian literature 2. Here it is a block introduction, unit 1, literature in Indian languages and the idea of modernity. Then unit 2, the center and periphery. Unit 3, Choma's drum. Unit 4, Godan. Okay, so we will discuss today the only unit 1, that is literature in Indian languages and the idea of modernity. Okay, so we will discuss unit 1, literature in Indian languages and the idea of modernity. So here it is the structure. You can see here the objectives, introduction, the idea of modernity, modernism in Indian in literature of Indian languages, modernism after India's independence, postmodernism, let us sum up, unit and questions, references and suggested reading. Here it is the objectives. The intent of this unit will be to acquaint the student with the idea of literary modernity in Indian languages in its many aspects. Apart from the simple idea of modernity and modernism in literature as opposed to tradition, the emphasis will be on the many kinds and meanings of modernity. This unit will discuss postmodern in a way that it helps understand modernity. The general accepted methods has been to contrast the earlier periods with the defining features of modernism. There is now the need of contrasting postmodern and modern in a similar way. Modernity will be explained not just in the context of tradition but also in the context of postmodernity and postmodernism. You will therefore be equipped to question the ideas and concepts of modern and postmodern and discuss these issues meaningfully with the literary text in the Indian languages as a base. Okay, here it is the main key point is modern and postmodern. Okay, sorry, here it is the main key points is modern and postmodern. Okay, postmodernity, postmodernism and modernity. Okay, so all these things we will discuss here. So, modern and postmodern and discuss these issues meaningfully with the literary text in the Indian languages as a base. The unit will have an equal emphasis on the modern literary text as well as on literary history, as you will be able to look at the order literary including the canonical text to locate features that are associated with modern and postmodern. You can then map the course of literature in Indian languages in a historical context. That is, the emphasis on modernity will help in tracing the development of new genres like the essay, the novel, free verse in the Indian languages. Here it is the introduction. Learning about modernism more than a decade after the year 2000 is quite different from doing so either in 1950 or even in 1980. Okay, the 20th century is fully behind us. Assuming that modernism in India began sometime around the 1850s, we look back at a span of more than 150 years. It is a long period and we can see that modernism passes through many phases. What modernism was in 1880s and 1890s is not the same as modernism in 1920s and 1930s. We also see modernism taking a different shape after independence. Okay, what is postmodernism and what is past modernism? Okay, here it is 1950 to 1980. The modernism is 2000 is quite different from doing so either in 1950 or even in 1990. So 20th century is fully behind us. Okay, so modernism in India began sometime around 1850s. So we look back at a span of more than 150 years. It is a long period, and we can see that modernism passes through many phases. What modernism was in the 1880s and 1890s is not the same as modernism in 1920s and 1930s. Okay. So we also see modernism taking a different shape after independence. So after independence, after 1948, the modernism also changes according to time. Then, as modernism did not remain the same over a country, it also assumes different names in its different forms. So we have the Renaissance period, the nationalist period, the romantic period, the progressive period, and the experimental period. So you remember this period, okay? So you remember this period. What are this period? Okay, this is the Renaissance, then nationalist, then romantic, then progressive and experimental. Okay. So Renaissance, nationalist, romantic, progressive and experimental period are the main key points here in unit 1 first page. Okay. So we have the Renaissance period, the nationalist period, the romantic period, then the progressive period and the experimental period. Each one of the period carries its own significance, but all of them carry the modern label as well. Okay. Each one of the periods carries its own significance and own literary values, but all of them carry the modern label as well, because it is post independence periods. The writers who were nationalists, romantics, progressives and experimentalists considered themselves modern. Okay. Here the writers who were nationalists, who were taking part in national movement, and romantics, romantic poet or romantic poets are there, then progressives and experimentalists consider themselves modern. Before you begin reading this section, it would be a good idea to jot down your own views about what modern is. Okay, already I have told it is the modernism is divided into two types, that is past modernism and postmodernism. The idea of modernity. One of the important things we realize as we map modernism in the literatures of Indian languages is that there is no single definition of modernism. It changes in shape and meaning as the 19th century ends and as different decades of the 20th century roll by. Okay? It changes in shape and meaning as the 19th century ends. As the 19th century ends, it changes, and as different decades of the 20th century roll by. The Dalit poets of the 1960s considered themselves modern. Okay. Here it is main Dalit poets is the main key point. At the 19th century end, the different decades of the 20th century roll by. Then the Dalit poets came. The Dalit poets of the 1960s considered themselves modern, and the feminist poets of the 1980s considered themselves modern. One of the interesting and challenging things about studying modernism is the rich variety of literary movements. So what are the literary movements we will study? The progress of modernism also shows how the country and the world have changed and how they use in modern label to describe and identify themselves. The progress of modernism also shows how the country and the world have changed. Okay. The progress of modernism also shows how the country and the world have changed and how they use the modern label to describe and identify themselves. The progress of modernism also shows how the country and the world have changed and how they use the modern label to describe and identify themselves. The progress of modernism also shows how the country and the world have changed and how they use the modern label to describe and identify themselves. There is, however, a need to distinguish between the modern and contemporary. Okay, here it is a distinction. Okay, distinguish between modern and contemporary. A writer of the 1970s is a contemporary writer to his readers and fellow writers of that decade. Okay, that decade means that is 10 years, 1970s to 1980s. Okay, but he did not necessarily be a modern writer. It is not enough to be writing in the 1970s and 1980s to be considered a modern writer. Most of the writers, whether they belong to the 1940s or the 1960s, identified for discussion under this topic are modern and not just contemporary. Okay. So, most of the writers, whether they belong to 1940s or 1960s, identified for discussion under this topic are modern and not just contemporary. Okay. Here these writers are considered to be modern, not just contemporary writers. It is also to be recognized that there is no single definition of the modern. At one level, it could mean rejection of the past. At another level, it could mean the revival of the past in a new form. Okay, and this is called Renaissance or rebirth. Okay, all of you know what is Renaissance or rebirth. Okay, it is a rebirth period, means already a thing is there and the writer or poet discover the new things. Okay, it is also to be recognized there is a single definition of the modern. At one level it could mean rejection of the past. At another level it could mean the revival of the past in a new form. Here it is a main key point I will give. See, at another level it could mean the revival of the past in new form and it is called Renaissance. Okay, it is a rebirth. A third meaning of modern is here it is the at another level it could mean the revival of the past in a new form. This is called Renaissance or rebirth. A third meaning of modern is celebration of scientific and industrial civilization. Okay, it could also mean rejection of the scientific and industrial civilization. The study of modernism is interesting and exciting because it is not a simple phenomenon. It is not just the literary or cultural. It has also to do with social, economic and political aspects of life, and each aspect influences the other. So, you should write in your exam, it has also to do with social, economic and political aspects of life. Okay, and each aspect influences the other. For example, the progressive writers of the modern period would not have emerged but for industrialization and urbanization and the emergence of the capitalist on the one hand and the working class on the other. There would have been no nationalist writers if there was no freedom struggle against the foreign ruler. Okay, there would have been no nationalist writers. Okay, so here you can see the structure of the sentence also. There would have been no nationalist writers. Okay, if there were no nationalist writers, then there was no freedom struggle against the foreign ruler. You can say in alternate ways. Okay, there would have been no nationalist writers if there was no freedom struggle against the foreign ruler. Okay, some grammatical concepts also I have discussed in this chapter. So, you can go through it. It is therefore necessary to know the time and location of a particular kind of modernism to understand the literature of the particular period and phase. It is therefore necessary to know the time and location of the particular kind of modernism to understand the literature of the particular period and phase. So, then come to 1.3. So, what is modernity in literature of Indian languages? So, as we know, many Indian languages are there, all of regional languages and also state languages. Okay. So, modernity in literature of Indian languages. The simple starting point will be to locate modernity in 19th and 20th centuries, when the defining feature is the emergence of prose forms, the essay, the novel and short story. The subject matter too changes, moving from characters of myth and fable and the historical past to the everyday reality of ordinary people in the present. Okay. The subject matter too changes, moving from characters of myth and fable and the historical past to the everyday reality of ordinary people in the present. Okay. Here the subject matter also changes, moving from characters of myth and fable and the historical past to the everyday reality of ordinary people. Here it is a major transition, you can see. Okay. What is the major transition? We will discuss. That is a major transition. Okay. Here it is the major transition, we can go through. The characters, the subject matter too changes. Okay. The subject matter too changes, moving from characters of myth and fable to historical past to everyday reality of ordinary people. Here it is a transition. Uma Shankar Joshi, the Gujarati literature sums up the advent of modernity in Indian literature lucidly in an essay Modernism and Indian Literature in 1958. Okay. Here is Uma Shankar Joshi, the Gujarati literature sums up the advent of modernity. Okay, sums up the advent of modernity in Indian literature lucidly. What do you mean by lucidly? Lucidly means clearly. Okay, in an essay, Modernism and Indian Literature. When this book was published? Here it is, the book was published was 1958. Okay, Modernism and Indian Literature, written by Gujarati literator Uma Shankar Joshi. Here it is the main key point, you can note down Uma Shankar Joshi. Okay, here it is the main key point, you can note down Uma Shankar Joshi, Gujarati literature. Okay, Uma Shankar Joshi, the Gujarati literature, sums up the advent of modernity in Indian literature lucidly in an essay, Modernism and Indian Literature 1958. Then he observes that the defining feature of modernity was the emergence of prose in the Indian languages. But there are larger connotations which go beyond literary forms. Okay, but there are larger connotations which go beyond literary forms about modernity as it imparts the Indian literary imagination. Okay, the larger connotations which go beyond literary forms about modernity as it imparts the Indian literary imagination. He writes, if we examine the literary output of 100 years ago, the first thing that strikes our attention is the emergence of prose as a potent vehicle of expression. Okay, if we examine the literary output of 100 years ago, okay, if we examine the literary output of 100 years ago, the first thing that strikes our attention is the emergence of prose. Okay, the first thing that strikes our attention is the emergence of prose as a potent vehicle of expression. Okay, the first thing was the prose. Okay, the literary output of 100 years ago, we can find the emergence of prose as the vehicle of expression, potent vehicle of expression. Prose has been sadly neglected in the past. Okay, so prose which was sadly neglected in the past. With Indians coming on the periphery of the industrial civilization and the consequent increase in mobility, communicational needs increased considerably. Okay, with India's comings on periphery of the industrial civilization and the consequent increase in mobility, communicational needs increased considerably, and prose was developed to meet these new needs. Okay, communicational needs increased considerably and prose was developed to meet these new needs. Okay, industrial civilization and the consequent increase in mobility, communicational needs increased considerably, and the prose was developed to meet these new needs. Communicational needs increased considerably and the prose was developed to meet these new needs. When India's coming on the periphery of the industrial civilization and consequent increase in mobility. Okay, when India is coming in periphery of the industrialization. Okay, here is when India is coming with the periphery of the industrial civilization. Okay, then the prose was developed. He identifies these three periods of modernity in the literatures of Indian languages, that is Renaissance, Modernism and Experimentalism. Okay, here he identifies three periods of modernity in the literatures of Indian languages, that is Renaissance, Modernism and Experimentalism. So, who identifies the three periods? That is Uma Shankar Joshi, the Gujarati literature, that is Modernism and Indian Literature was his book. In 1958 it was published, and he identifies three periods of modernity in the literatures of Indian languages, that is Renaissance, Modernism and Experimentalism. Here it is the main key point, you can note down. Okay, he identifies three periods of modernity in the literatures of Indian languages, that is Renaissance, Modernism and Experimentalism. Okay, in a bold interpretation of modern Indian history, he looks at 1857, which marked the first war of Indian independence. Okay, 1857, the first war of Indian independence, as a turning point because the first Indian universities Calcutta, Madras and Bombay were established in that year, and it is the first graduates of these universities, okay, which included Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who set out to write the modern Indian literary works with a deep awareness of the Indian tradition. Here Bankim Chandra Chatterjee was there, who was the first graduates of these universities, that is Calcutta, Madras and Bombay. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who set out to write the modern Indian literary works with a deep awareness of the Indian tradition, okay, Indian tradition and values and ethos was clearly mentioned in his literary writings. Okay, he argues the focal point of Indian Renaissance is perhaps 1857, the year of two great events, the attempt at overthrowing foreign rule and the founding of universities at Calcutta. Okay, the focal point of Indian Renaissance is perhaps 1857, the year of two great events, the attempt at overthrowing foreign rule and the founding of universities at Calcutta. Okay, here he wrote the focal point of Indian Renaissance, that is 1857, the two great events, the attempt at overthrowing foreign rule and founding of universities at Calcutta, Madras and Bombay. The patriotism of the university men was directed into more sound and constructive channels. They were not completely swept away by the West as the preceding generation of reforms had been. Thanks to the teachings of ancient classics, their sense of self-respect was rehabilitated and the visionaries among them dreamt of a synthesis of all that was based in the East and West. Okay, they are not completely swept away by the West as the preceding generation of reformers had been. Thanks to the teaching of ancient classics, their sense of self-respect was rehabilitated and the visionaries among them dreamt of a synthesis of all that was based in the East and West. Okay, so what was his teaching? Is the teaching of ancient classics. Okay, that sense of self-respect, rehabilitated and visionaries. Then it was from East to West. A period of consolidation of the cultural gains began as the first graduates came out from the universities. Then Ananda Shankar Ray, the Bengali writer and essayist, approaches the issue from a slightly different point of view and defines modernity in terms of humanism. Okay, Ananda Shankar Ray was a Bengali writer and essayist, approaches the issues from a slightly different point of view. Okay, Ananda Shankar Ray wrote slightly different point of view according to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Okay, the modernity in terms of humanism. In the essay The Meeting of the East and West, 1958, he locates the advent of modernity. Okay, Ananda Shankar Ray wrote The Meeting of East and West, which was published in 1958. Also in 1958, Uma Shankar Joshi, Gujarati literature, produced the Modernism and Indian literature. Here is again 1958, The Meeting of the East and West, which was written by Ananda Shankar Ray, a Bengali writer. During the early years of 19th century, far-sighted Indians led by Ram Mohan Roy realized that their country had been isolated not only in space but also in time. Okay, during the early years of 19th century, far-sighted Indians led by Ram Mohan Roy realized that their country had been isolated not only in space but also in time. Okay, the 19th century far-sighted Indians led by Ram Mohan Roy, which was a great reformer of India. You already know that. In history also we have read in class time, school time. To bring India in line with modern age, they decided upon a Western education, and to link her with the rest of the world, they defied the social ban on sea voyages. These two events had great importance in the history of our culture in the 19th century. A spirit of humanism entered our thought and found expression in our literature. Ray goes on to mark out the humanism that defines modern literature. In the same essay he writes, simultaneously Bengali and other languages entered upon their modern period, which was also their humanist period. They were no longer tied to theology, mythology and scholasticism. Okay, simultaneously Bengali and other languages entered upon their modern period, which was also their humanist period. They were no longer tied to theology, mythology and scholasticism. Here it is the main key point of Raja Ram Mohan Roy's writings. Okay, you can note down. That is they were no longer tied to theology, mythology and scholasticism. No gods and goddesses descend from the skies, and played a part in human situations. The world revealed by Western seers was an intensely human world of individuals striving against odds without a supernatural being suddenly appearing and warding off tragedy. Okay, no gods and goddess descended from the skies was his thinking. The world revealed by Western seers was an intensely human world of individuals. Okay, that is the world is human world of individuals striving against odds without a supernatural being suddenly appearing or warding off tragedy. Yet this had been the climate of our literature in the past, for a matter of the medieval literature of the Western countries as well. This change of climate was not so much a Western phenomenon as a modern orientation. Okay, this change of climate was not so much a Western phenomenon as a modern orientation. He also observes that modern Indian literature at the beginning did not stop with the humanism of European Renaissance, but that it also absorbed the French revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality. Okay, he also observes the modern Indian literature at the beginning did not stop with the humanism of European Renaissance, but that it also absorbed the French revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality. Okay. He also observes that modern Indian literature at the beginning did not stop with the humanism of European Renaissance, but that it also absorbed the French revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality. So what is the French revolutionary ideas? That is, the French revolutionary ideas was liberty and equality. Okay. So here you can note down that is the French revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality was his thinking. Okay, modern Indian literature at the beginning did not stop with the humanism of European Renaissance. That is, it was influenced by French revolutionary ideas of liberty and equality. Ray explores the contradictions that emerge when modernity is seen as a Western concept imposed by the British colonial rulers, and how Gandhi's Swadeshi makes everyone turn away from Western education and everything Western. Okay. So Swadeshi movement was taken by Gandhiji and makes everyone turn away from Western education and everything Western. Okay, turn away from. What do you mean by turn away from? So what do you mean by turn away from? Okay, what do you mean by turn away from? Here it is in the sentence, you can see. What do you mean by turn away from? Here it is, turn away from. What does this phrase comprises of? Okay, the turn away from means, that is, debarred. Okay, turn away from Western education and everything Western. Okay, so Western education and everything Western, Gandhiji's Swadeshi movement was there. He notes that Tagore, to realize the need to reject the materialism of the modern West and affirm spiritual values, Ray confronts the inherent contradictions in the idea of modernity. Joshi and Ray offer interesting interpretations of the beginnings of modernity in Indian literatures. Okay, Joshi and Ray offer interesting interpretations of the beginnings of modernity in Indian literatures. Okay. Their arguments might appear to be overlapping in some of the details, but their views remain distinct. Joshi and Ray offer interesting interpretations of the beginnings of modernity in the Indian literatures. Their arguments might appear to be overlapping in some of the details, but their views remain distinct. Try and find out whether you can think of a modern movement in Indian literary history before the 19th century and before the British era. For example, do you think that when poets began to write in their own languages like Tamil, Kannada, Telugu, Marathi, Hindi instead of writing in Sanskrit? Okay. It can be called a break with tradition and beginning of the modern period. So, in many Indian languages, the poets and writers started to write their thinking or imagination or ideas. Okay. Here it is the beginning of the modern period. So Joshi locates the emergence of modernism in 1930s and makes an important distinction between modernity and modernism. So modernity in literature can be seen as a response to the industrial civilization. whereas modernism in a way turning inwards with an emphasis on the individual's feeling and his or perception of the world. The poetic movement, which has come to be known as Chayabad in Hindi, can be termed modernist in this sense. Okay, the poetic movement which has come to be known as Chayabad also. Okay, the Chayabad was also published in Hindi and can be termed modernist in this sense. On the other hand, Premchand, with his realistic depiction of the middle and poor classes of people in towns and villages in his novels and short stories, represents in many ways the high tide of modernity. Okay, Premchand, all of you know Premchand, with his realistic depiction of the middle and poor classes of people in towns and villages in his novels and short stories, represents in many ways the high tide of modernity. He is also identified with the progressive school with allegiance to leftist politics derived from Marxian ideas. Okay, he is also identified with the progressive school with allegiance to leftist politics derived from Marxian ideas. Okay, identified the progressive school with allegiance of leftist politics and Marxian ideas. So, progressivism with the Marxist tint becomes pronounced in Urdu poetry of 1930s and 1940s. In Urdu too, the 1930s saw the emergence of progressive poets and story writers. There was also the modernist element represented by two poets, Miraji and N.M. Rashid, also known as Noon Mim Rashid. Okay, two Urdu poets urged in 1930s. They were the modernist element represented by these two poets, that is Miraji and N.M. Rashid, that is Noon Mim Rashid was his full name. So, you can note down the two Urdu poets, that is Miraji and N.M. Rashid in 1930s, that is the emergence of progressive poets and story writers. Apart from Urdu, the leftist turn in literature became prominent in Telugu, where it lasted into the 1970s, rejuvenated by the Naxal movement of the late 1960s. There was an interesting development in Telugu poetry with the emergence of a group of poets who called themselves Digambara Kabulu or naked poets. Okay, so here you can note down the main points. What is Digambara Kabulu or naked poets? Okay, Digambara Kabulu and naked poets was the major emergence of literature that was prominent in Telugu 1970s and 1960s, that is Naxal movement was there, and an interesting development in Telugu poetry, that is Digambara Kabulu or naked poets. Kabulu means it is Hindi, it was Kabya. Okay, Sanskrit also Kabya. So, Kabulu means Telugu, it is poem or any song. This group sought to break with the leftist ideological rhetoric of the progressive group and declared an anarchist manifesto denouncing political ideology as such. This group sought to break with the leftist ideological rhetoric. Okay, this group sought to break with the leftist ideological rhetoric of the progressive group and declared an anarchist manifesto denouncing political ideology as such. Okay, this group sought to break with the leftist ideological rhetoric of the progressive group and declared an anarchist manifesto denouncing political ideology as such. Okay, so to break with the leftist ideological rhetoric of the progressive group and declared an anarchist manifesto denouncing political ideology as such. Okay, its poetry described the drab daily life of ordinary people, which essentially was the state of not so well to do middle and lower middle class people. Okay, this group sought to break with the leftist ideological rhetoric of the progressive group and declared an anarchist manifesto denouncing political ideology as such. Its poetry described the drab daily life of ordinary people, which essentially was the state of not so well to do middle and lower middle class people. Not so well to do middle and lower middle class people. That is anarchist manifesto denouncing political ideology. Okay. Some of the prominent voices of the group were Nikhileshwar, Jwalamukhi and Naganamuni. Okay. Here it is the some of the prominent voices of this group are Nikileshwar, Jwalamukhi and Nagna Muni. Okay. The Digambara Kavalu were in fact responding to the explicitly leftist Biplaba Rachayatula Sangham, okay, Revolutionary Writers Association. The Digambara Kavalu were in fact responding to the explicitly leftist Biplava Rachayatula Sangham or Revolutionary Writers Association. Biplava Rachayatula Sangham. You can note down, here it is Biplava Rachayatula Sangham. Biplava Rachayatula Sangham. The Digambara Kavalu were in fact responding to the explicitly leftist Biplava Rachayatula Sangham, that is Revolutionary Writers Association. Okay. In Marathi, a group of Dalit writers including Namdev Dhasal created a literary storm. Okay. Marathi also there is some poets, is the Dalit writers including Namdev Dhasal. Okay. Namdev Dhasal created a literary storm by using poetry as a vehicle to express the life of deprivation and despair of the Dalits. Dhasal attempted to translate this literary impulse by starting the Dalit Partners Party on the lines of the Black Panthers, okay, which was created by black activists at the height of the civil rights movement in the United States. Here it is the Dalit movements. Here it is the Dalit movement, that is Marathi Namdev Dhasal. Here is the poetry, he used poetry as a vehicle to express the life of deprivation and despair of the Dalits. Dhasal attempted to translate the literary impulse by starting the Dalit Panthers Party. He was started the Dalit Panthers Party on the lines of the Black Panthers, which was created by black activists at the heights of civil rights movement in the United States. The political move was not a success, but the poetry of the Dalit writers remains a turning point in modern Marathi literary history. Okay, the political move was not a success, but the poetry of the Dalit writers remains a turning point in modern Marathi literary history. Okay, the political move was not a success, but the poetry of the Dalit writers remain a turning point. Here it is all about modern Marathi literary history. Who was the Marathi writer? As a Dalit writer, the name was Namdev Dhasal. Then modernism became avant-garde, new and experimental. What do you mean by avant-garde? Avant-garde means new and experimental in Hindi literature, with the publication of Tar Saptak. Okay, the publication of Tar Saptak, that is 1943 it was published, an anthology of poems by a group of new writers led by IGNOU, and which included writers like Gajanan Muktibodh and Nemichand Jain. Tar Saptak was published in 1943, and this anthology of poems by a group of new writers led by IGNOU, which was included writers like Gajanan Muktibodh and Nemichand Jain. Here it is the main key point, Gajanan Muktibodh and Nemichand Jain. Okay, Gajanan Muktibodh and Nemichand Jain, that is the group of poems, the group of new writers, that is IGNOU, Tar Saptak 1943. Okay, so 1943 it is Tar Saptak. Okay, there are however two interesting developments in Urdu which are worthy of notice. That is IGNOU, that is Gajanan Muktibodh and Nemichand Jain. In the early 1950s, a similar experimental move was made with regard to storytelling that came to be known as Nai Kahani. Okay, storytelling Nai Kahani was published, which had writers like Nirmal Barma among them. Nai Kahani, which had writers like Nirmal Barma among them. There are however two interesting developments in Urdu which are worthy of notice. It is in Urdu that journalism emerged first. There can be no better vehicle of prose to report and describe day-to-day matters than through the journalistic medium. So in Urdu, first journalism emerged first. Okay, and there can be no better vehicle of prose in Urdu. So, the journalistic medium was there. The second development from the literary point of view was that of the epistolary tradition. Okay, what do you mean by epistolary tradition? Already you have read this. What do you mean by epistolary tradition? Or the writing of letters as an art form. The epistolary tradition. Okay, here it is epistolary tradition. Here it is the epistolary tradition. Epistolary tradition or the writing of letters as an art form. The emergence of modern Urdu prose goes back to the writers at Fort William College in Calcutta, who prepared textbooks in the language for the East India Company officials to learn the language of the people in North India for administrative purposes. The emergence of modern Urdu prose goes back to the writers at Fort William College in Calcutta. The emergence of modern Urdu prose goes back to the writers at Fort William College in Calcutta, who prepared textbooks in the language of the East India Company officials to learn the language of the people in North India for administrative purposes. Okay. So, East India Company, the first establishment of company by Britishers was there. So, the emergence of modern Urdu prose goes back to the writers at Fort William College in Calcutta, who prepared textbooks. Okay, Fort William College in Calcutta, there is Urdu writers prepared the textbooks for East India Company. Okay. Then people in North India for administrative purposes. Then Mirza Ghalib, 1795 to 1869, Mirza Ghalib, considered the greatest Urdu poet, wrote letters spanning a 20-year period from the late 1840s to late 1860s, which show how he freely uses English words and forges an informal and conversational style of writing. Okay. So, Mirza Ghalib 1795 to 1869 considered the greatest Urdu poet, wrote letters spanning a 20-year period from the late 1840s to 1860s. Mirza Ghalib, a Urdu poet 1795 to 1869, wrote letters spanning a 20-year period from late 1840s to 1860s. Mirza Ghalib, a Urdu poet, so how he freely uses English words and forges an informal and conversational style of writing. So, Mirza Ghalib was first Urdu poet who wrote the forges an informal and conversational style of writing. In the span of less than a century, Urdu prose came to be used extensively for diverse purposes, including history, literary history and criticism. Some of the early works of history and literary criticism have been written in Urdu. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's account of archaeological remains of Delhi, along with brief sketches of the Delhi notables of his time, known as Asar-us-Sanadid. Okay. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's account of the archaeological remains of Delhi, along with brief sketches of the Delhi notables of his time, known as Asar-us-Sanadid 1847, is a major breakthrough. Okay. So, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's account of archaeological remains of Delhi, along with brief sketches of Delhi notables of his time, known as Asar-us-Sanadid 1847, is a major breakthrough. So, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's account of archaeological remains of Delhi, along with brief sketches of the Delhi notables of his time, known as Asar-us-Sanadid 1847, is a major breakthrough. Asar-us-Sanadid 1847 is a major breakthrough. It is a Delhi archaeological remains of Delhi, that is Sir Ahmad Khan's account. A close associate, Altaf Hussain, a close associated Altaf Hussain Ali wrote a literary biography of the greatest Urdu poet of 19th century. Here it is the main key point you can note down. Okay, here it is the main key point you can note down. Altaf Hussain Ali wrote a literary biography of the greatest Urdu poet of 19th century, Altaf Hussain Ali, that is Mirza Ghalib. It was called Yadgar-e-Ghalib and it was published in 1898. Then here it is the activity, identify the emergence of prose in Indian language of your choice. What was it used for? Was it for writing an essay, novel or letter? Was it used to write about history, science and politics? Okay. In the first days of modernism, we see three phases. The first was the adoption of the Western literary forms prose novel, and it became an effective and appropriate mode of communications in keeping with the changed styles of life. The second stage was that of using the Western literary forms to assert nationalist pride. The third phase was the experimental, when writers were seeking to explore new modes of expression. Here it is the main key point, you can note down. Okay, what was the movement of literary movement of comparative literature? So the first was the adoption, okay, adoption of the Western literary forms, prose novel, and it became an effective and appropriate mode of communication in keeping with the changed styles of life. The second was that using the Western literary forms to assert nationalist pride. Okay, nationalist pride was second reform, second stage. Excuse me. The third phase was the experimentalism. Okay, the third phase was experimentalism, when writers were seeking to explore new modes of expression. Each of these stages was generally represented by a generation, and it unwittingly turned into a battle of generations. The post-Tagore group known as Kalol, and which included Buddhadev Bose. Okay, the post-Tagore group known as Kalol, which included Buddhadev Bose, Vishnu De, Amiya Chakrabarti, Samar Sen, and Jivananand Das, felt a need to rebel against the domineering presence of Rabindranath Tagore. Okay, the post-Tagore group came, they opposed or they created a rebel against the domineering presence of Rabindranath Tagore. Okay, so known as Kalol. Okay, that is a Kalol movement, which included Buddhadev Bose, Vishnu De, Amiya Chakrabarti, Samar Sen, and Jivananand Das. Okay, Buddhadev Bose, you can remember Buddhadev Bose, 2 to 3 names, Buddhadev Bose, Vishnu De, Amiya Chakrabarti, or Samar Sen, Jivanananda Das, felt a need to rebel against the domineering presence of Rabindranath Tagore. It was a complex. Okay, so here it is. Sorry. The post-Tagore group known as Kalol, which was included Buddhadev Bose, Vishnu De, Amiya Chakrabarti, Samar Sen, and Jivanananda Das, felt a need to rebel against the domineering presence of Rabindranath Tagore. It was a complex art, and Das, who embodied modernism in its true Western sense, disillusionment, and the modern era of industrial civilization and nationalist conflicts, did not accept rebellion against Tagore as the only way out. Thus, speaking of modern poetry in Bangla, says, poets are not born as a result of conspiracy to overthrow the great poets preceding them. Okay, so thus speaking of modern poetry in Bangla, says, poets are not born as a result of conspiracy to overthrow the great poets, okay, preceding them. It is with the help of pointers from Tagore that modern Bengali poetry made a tiny start, and its development will not culminate in the demolition of the fundamentals of Bengali literature or of Tagore. Okay, it is the help of pointers from Tagore that modern Bengali poetry made a tiny start, and its development will not culminate in the demolition of the fundamentals of Bengali literature or of Tagore. Quoted by Chidananda Dasgupta, who translated Das poems into English 9. But it was not an easy relationship between those who wanted to bring in the strand of modernism as against modernity. Dasgupta writes in his introduction to Das anthology, in his salad days, the young Jivanananda would spend his poems to Rabindranath Tagore, hoping for words of encouragement, only to be met with an embarrassed disapproval. Okay, so while Jivanananda Das wrote against Rabindranath Tagore, because in young days, young Jivanananda would send his poems to Rabindranath Tagore, hoping for words of encouragement, only to be met with an embarrassed disapproval. Rabindranath Tagore disapproved his writings. Okay, to Tagore, elegance of language was as vital as richness of meaning, striking roots in tradition, as important as being contemporary. Okay, So Tagore elegance of language was as vital as richness of meaning, striking roots in tradition as important as being contemporary. Perhaps he could not stomach the young aspirants' lines like from the spittle, the blood and the excreta, the fly rises into the sunlight, or turning the hydrant on. The leper licks up water. The patriarch admitted that the young poet had some talent, but complained that he persecuted the language. Binaya Dhar Wadekar, okay, Binaya Dhar Wadekar, confining himself to poetry, tries to provide a slightly different map of Indian poetry in 20th century. In his essay, Some Contest of Modern Indian Poetry, he identifies the period between 1910 to 1930 as the nationalist phase, and he identifies Rabindranath Tagore, Bengali, Aurobindo Ghosh, English, Sridhar Pathak, Maithili Sharan Gupta, and Makhanlal Chaturvedi, Hindi, as the poets who reflected the nationalist mood. So, who reflected the nationalist mood? According to Binay Dharwadkar, okay, Binay Dharwadkar, who was the nationalist phase poet, that is Rabindranath Tagore, Aurobindo Ghosh, Sridhar Pathak, Maithili Sharan Gupta, and Makhanlal Chaturvedi. Okay, you can note down these names. Okay, according to Binay Dharwadkar, according to Binay Dharwadkar, here is the Rabindranath Tagore, Aurobindo Ghosh, Sridhar Pathak, Maithili Sharan Gupta, Makhanlal Chaturvedi was the poets of reflected nationalist mood. This was followed by Romantic period lasting between 1920 to 1935, which was an echo of British Romantic poets of the 19th century. The Romantic influence could be seen in the works of Lakshminath Bezbarua, Raghunath Rai Chaudhary, Jatindranath Dwara, that is the works of Lakshminath Bezbarua, Raghunath Rai Chaudhary, Jatindranath Dwara, Assamese poet, Raya Porulu Subbarao, and Debulapalli Krishna Sastri, Telugu, that is Debulapalli Krishna Sastri, Raya Prolu Subbarao, and Madhav Julian, and Rabi Kiran Mandal, and Mahadevi Burma in Hindi. Okay. Dharwadkar argues that two other movements overlapped with that of nationalism and romanticism in 1930s. The first trend was that of progressive who believed in some kind of Marxist ideology, and it could be seen in many of the Indian languages and lasted into 1980s. Marxist ideology was seen in many of the Indian languages and lasted into 1980s. He describes the progressive movement in poetry in the following terms. Many of the progressive criticized and rejected the patriotism and romanticism of their predecessors and attempted to paint a bleak, often starkly violent, even anti-nationalistic portrait of Indian society, choosing invective, satire, and irony over epic seriousness and lyricism. Okay. That is attempted to paint a bleak, often starkly violent, even anti-nationalistic portrait of Indian society, choosing invective, satire, and irony over epic seriousness and lyricism. Some of the progressive poets he identifies are Raghubir Sahai and Kedarnath Singh in Hindi. Some of the progressive poets he identifies are Raghubir Sahai and Kedarnath Singh in Hindi, Binda Karandikar in Marathi, and Sunil Gangopadhyay in Bengali. Okay, some of the progressive poets he identifies that is anti-nationalistic portrait of Indian society, choosing invective, satire, and irony over epic seriousness and lyricism. Okay, the progressive movement was started. Some of the progressive poets he identified as Raghubir Sahai, Kedarnath Singh in Hindi, Binda Karandikar in Marathi, and Sunil Gangopadhyay in Bengali. The other countrywide phenomenon that Dharwadkar identifies in rather specific terms is that of Indian counterpart of Anglo-American modernism, which simply translated into free verse. Okay, that is, a free verse poet was there. The Indian counterpart Anglo-American modernism, Dharwadkar identifies rather specific terms. And what this modernism means in terms of themes and subjects? His answer: they concentrated on such themes as the disintegration of traditional communities, and familiar cultural institutions. The alienation of individual in urban society, the dissociation of thought and feeling, the disasters of modernization, the ironies of daily existence, okay, and the anguish of unresolved doubts and anxieties. The disasters of modernization, the ironies of daily existence, and the anguish of unresolved doubts and anxieties Vinay Dharwadekar found in progressive period. The poets that Dharwadekar identifies with this Anglo-American modernism are B.S. Mardhekar in Marathi in 1940s, Dilip Chitre and Arun Kolatkar again in Marathi in 1960s, Navanita Devsen in Bengali, Kunwar Narayan in Hindi and Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh in Gujarati. Okay, Vinay Dharwadekar found some progressive movements of poets. There is Anglo-American modernism in 1940s, B.S. Mardhekar, Dilip Chitre, Arun Kolatkar. Okay, you can memorize these two to three poets' name, that is B.S. Mardhekar, Dilip Chitre and Arun Kolatkar. Okay, Navanita Devsen in Bengali and Kunwar Narayan in Hindi. Ghulam Mohammad Sheikh was in Gujarati. An issue that Dharwadekar raises is the importance of foreign influences, especially the French connection. While talking about modernism in Indian literatures, it is assumed that all the modern ideas and influences derived from English literature. It is generally true, as Dharwadekar had himself noted while discussing modernism, but he rightly sees that there is another aspect of modernism which is not derived from English but from the French. He is of the view that Michael, Madhusudan Dutt and Toru Dutt in 19th century. Okay, Vinay Dharwadekar was found that Michael, Madhusudan Dutt and Toru Dutt in 19th century showed French influence. Okay, Michael, Madhusudan Dutt and Toru Dutt in 19th century showed French influence. Here it is a main key point. You can jot down, that is Madhusudan Dutt, Michael Madhusudan Dutt and Toru Dutt 19th century showed French Revolution, which was found by Vinay Dharwadekar. But is this more the explicit influence of modern French poets like Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Rimbaud and Paul Valéry? Okay, that is the French poets like Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Rimbaud and Paul Valéry. Okay, some French poets name you can also remember. Okay, some French poets name you can also remember. French poets like, that is explicit influence of modern French poets like Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Rimbaud and Paul Valéry. Okay, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Rimbaud and Paul Valéry. He identifies Buddhadev Bose and Navanita Devsen as the two poets who worked out the influences of these French authors in their poetry. Dharwadekar describes the French influence in Bengali poetry in the post-independence era. Okay, Dharwadekar describes the French influence in Bengali poetry in the post-independence era and its immersion in metropolitan culture. Okay, its immersion in metropolitan culture. Then, its love and hate relationship with modernity, its simultaneous provincialism and cosmopolitanism, its zeal of revolutions carry strong traces of French influence. Here it comes to French influence, that is progressive period. He also details the influence of the Spanish language poet from Chile, Pablo Neruda's influence. Okay, Chill, Pablo Neruda's influence in Hindi and Gujarati, Odia and Malayalam, that is Spanish language poet from Chile or Child, Pablo Neruda's influence in Hindi, Gujarati, Odia and Malayalam. An important assessment of modern poets in India is how some of them go back to the past and reinvent some of the older literary forms. He makes the acute observation, although all modern poets reject the past in order to become modern, they often end using the past imaginatively and constructively in a multitude of ways. Many modern writers are quite paradoxically traditionalist and classicist. Okay? Although all modern poets reject the past in order to become modern, they often end using the past imaginatively and constructively in a multitude of ways. Okay, reject the past in order to become modern, they often end using the past imaginatively and constructively in a multitude of ways. Many modern writers are quite paradoxically traditionalist and classicist. Okay. Then activity 3. Dharwadekar had identified foreign influences on some of the modern Indian poets. Following Dharwadekar's examples, try and identify foreign influences in the modern Indian novel. Look for novelists who have used the stream of consciousness method following the examples of James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, and those who have used magical realism following the example of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Okay. It can now be claimed that the concept of modernity in Indian literature has a beginning and it has an end, and that it can be studied like other literary periods, classical and romantic, ancient and medieval. It is quite likely that there would be greater anonymity as to when the modernist began in the history of Indian letters, though debates cannot be ruled out about this aspect as well, but there will be no anonymity as to when it has ended. There will be many who will argue that it has not ended. Then come to 1.4, modernity after Indians independence. Okay, what was about modernity after Indians independence? Okay, so we will study the modernity after Indian independence. An interesting question that a student of that idea of modernity in Indian languages faces is, after India gained independence in 1947, what was the status of modernity? In the political, social and economic spheres, it was felt that India has to go long way to achieve modernity. Okay, all of you know about that is the postmodernism period, that is modernity after Indians independence. The first 2-3 paragraphs I will just read out. You already know these facts, just listen to my words. In the political sphere, it was felt that India has to go long way to achieve modernity. In the political sphere, it was felt that institutions like parliament, educational institution should articulate people's views in a democratic setup. Okay, it was felt that institutions like parliament, educational institutions should help articulate people's views in a democratic setup. In the social sphere, the emphasis was on equality and the liberty to express individual opinions. And in economic sphere, the idea was to end deprivation and poverty, which is an indirect affirmation of the idea of equality. It is natural then that in the literature of independent India, this concern and ideas plays a dominant role. This did not, however, mean that writers turned to socialist realism and that they did not do anything but translate the official agenda of national concerns in their writings. They did not, however, mean the writers turned to socialist realism that they did not do anything but translate the official agenda of national concerns in their writings. They did not, however, mean that writers turned to socialist realism that they did not do anything but translate the official agenda of nationalist concern in their writings. However, there were many who did that also. This did not, however, mean that writers turned to socialist realism and that they did not do anything but translate the official agenda of national concerns in their writings. However, there were many who did that also. Did not, however, mean that writers turned to socialist realism that they did not do anything but translate the official agenda of national concern in these writings. Here it is the main point, you can note down. The writers turned to socialist realism and they did not do anything but translate the official agenda of national concerns in their writings. Writing in 1999 in the Sahitya Akademi Journal, Indian Literature, Kannada writer S.L. Bhairappa had argued about the impact of independence, democracy and universal education and literature in the country. Writing in 1999 in the Sahitya Akademi Journal, Indian Literature, Kannada writer S.L. Bhairappa had argued about the impact of independence. Indian Literature, Kannada writer S.L. Bhairappa had argued about the impact of independence, democracy and universal education on literature in the country. He wrote in the essay titled Abiding Values in Indian Literature. Okay, he wrote in the essay titled Abiding Values in Indian Literature, a new thing happened to the growth of Indian literature with the extent of universal education. That is, the writers S.L. Bhairappa had argued about the impact of independence, democracy and universal education and literature in the country. He wrote in the essay titled Abiding Values in Indian Literature, a new thing happened in the growth of Indian literature with the extension of universal education. Sections of society which hitherto could not even dream of expressing its experiences in written language gave rise to writers. So, Indian literature started to extend its boundaries. He is also viewed that democracy in the country developed along caste lines and the political groups and pressure groups developed within each caste. Bhairappa then turns to the issue of how these trends have impacted literature. Literature became more and more socio-political than an activity of imagination, of giving expression to the deeper experiences of the people. This is a controversial assessment by one of the eminent modern writers in the country. There will be many who will disagree with this view because he does not seem to think that the politicization of literature is good or positive. Okay, this is a controversial assessment by one of the eminent modern writers in the country. There will be many who will disagree with his view because he did not seem to think that politicization of literature is good or positive. A little later in the essay, he hits out against the modernists, especially those propagating the progressive or Marxist view of modernity. He says, if a talented young person publishes a few good poems or short stories or a novel, the moment readers compliment him or her, earn his or her gratitude and then deign into his or her ear, you belong to a suppressed community. Okay, he says, if a talented young person publishes a few good poems or short stories or a novel, the moment readers compliment him or her, earn his or her gratitude and then deign into his or her ear, you belong to a suppressed community. Your forefathers and ancestors suffered indignities since 5,000 years. Your forefathers and ancestors suffered indignities since 5,000 years. It is your duty to express those sufferings, frustrations and anger in your creative writing and incite your community people to act against those who perpetrated these inhuman atrocities. Okay. It is your duty to express those sufferings, frustration and anger in your creative writing and incite your community people to act against those who perpetrated these inhuman atrocities. The young writer falls victim to his preaching and is gradually frozen into committed writer and is prevented from growing into a creative one. In the same way, the talented young woman is forced to become a feminist writer. Okay. Some of the important books in the 1950s in the Indian languages pose a challenge to the critic, scholar and reader because they do not fit the ideological mold as described by Vairappa, but they do meet the criterion he has outlined for a creative writer. The writers we will mention now were pursuing the creative path as described by Vairappa. A creative writer has a wider moral responsibility than the one propounded by a socio-political campaigner. In fact, every literary creation explores a new set of moral right, though moral preaching is not the purpose of literature. Okay? Though moral preaching is not the purpose of literature. Do you agree with Bhairappa assessment? What do you think has been the impact of democracy on literature in India? Here it is activity 4, which you can collect from many journals or many insights or many books and you can write down in your own words. Okay? Then come to 1.5 postmodernism. It is important to note that writers in different Indian languages were striking a new path of their own, nearly unaware of the developments in languages other than their own. In 1951, Muhammad Baikon Basir wrote Nuttu Pukkaro Nandaranu, my grandfather had an elephant. Okay, Muhammad Baikon Basir wrote in 1951. Here it is a very big name. You just split the name and again produce the whole name, that is NTUPPU, that is Nittupuppa Korananderunu. Okay, NTUPPU PPA KKORANENDARNNU. Nittupuppa Koranenderanu. Okay, Nittupuppa Koranenderanu, my grandfather had an elephant, which is written in the dialect used by Muslims in North Kerala. Okay, the my grandfather had an elephant, which is written by Muhammad Baikon Basir. Okay, Muhammad Baikon Basir in Kerala, 1951. Nittupuppa Koranendaranu. Okay, Nittupuppa Koranendaranu. Nittupuppa Koranendaranu, you can remember. Okay. Then Phanishwar Nath Renu's Maila Anchal was published in 1954. Phanishwar Nath Renu's Maila Anchal was published in 1954, and what marked the novel was the use of local dialect and not the standard literary Khariboli. Okay, this was a departure from the norm. Mohammed Rakesh play आषाढ़ का एक दिन written in 1958. What is Mohan Rakesh play आषाढ़ का एक दिन? That is the 1958 gives a lyrical turn to the language and imposes the 1950s mood of IGNOU, which is of the philosophical nature deriving from then and dominant philosophy of existentialism. In 1964, Kannada writer Girish Kannad's play Tughlaq brought into play the interaction between political leader and history. So, here this is the main point, you can note down and you can eliminate also this point because it is very important. Girish Kannad's play, that is 1964, it is a Kannada writer Tughlaq. Okay, Girish Kannad's Tughlaq brought into play in 1964. It is the political leader and history. Though it was seen as a comment on the tragic end years of Indian first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, it can now be read as more universal portrayal. Marathi playwright Vijay Tendulkar's Santata, that is Court Chalu A. Okay, Vijay Tendulkar's Santata, that is Marathi playwright Vijay Tendulkar's Santata, Court Chalu Ahe, Quiet. The Court is in sensation, produced in 1967, explored sexual mores in the form of rehearsal of a play in the play. Okay, that is a sexual mores in the form of rehearsal of play in the play. In 1967, it was written by Vijay Tendulkar Santata, Court Chalu Ahe. Quiet, the court is in session. But the more devastating portrayal of violence, both physical and psychological, in contemporary society and family came in 1961 play, that is Gidhade. Okay, Gidhade 1961 play, contemporary society and family issues, that is the Vultures, which was produced only in 1970. Then it is the writings of Basir, Renu, Rakesh, Karnad and Tendulkar, which one can see the glimpses of what can be called postmodernism. These writers were now struggling to break away from tradition or classicism as a modern writer would tend to do. They were moving beyond social portrayal or experimentation with literary form. Through their writings, they are trying to explore the aesthetics of experience, as in Rakesh Ansad Ka Ek Din, okay, Rakesh Asad Ka Ek Din, as well as simple but subtle aspects of human psychology. Tendulkar's plays look at the harsh aspects of life of mostly middle class families. Okay, Tendulkar's plays look at the harsh aspect of life of mostly middle class families. Though in Sakaram Binder, the hero and heroine belong to the working of artisanal class. Sakaram Binder, the hero and heroine belong to the working of artisanal class. Postmodernism is difficult phenomenon to identify as yet because there is no consensus on what the features of postmodernism are. As we know, the features of modernism like free verse in poetry or the description of the lives of ordinary people and the ordinary language they use. Okay, postmodernism is a difficult phenomenon to identify as yet because there is no consensus on what the features of postmodernism are. As we know, the features of modernism like free verse in poetry or the description of the lives of ordinary people and the ordinary language they use. It would however be difficult to describe all the literary works written from late 19th century to early 21st century to be modern, a single phenomenon. Modernism had gone through many changes and it appears that it has also ended at some point. The interesting thing would be to ask the question, when did modernism end? Did it end at all? Are we still dealing with modernity and modernism as we read a novel or a play or a poem written in the last decade of the 20th century and the first of the 21st century? We know the beginnings of modernism. Do you know the end of modernism? It appears that we may not have clear answers about the death of modernism. But it is necessary to ask the question. It will enable us to look at modernism from a different perspective. So, come to let us sum up 1.6. It is quite clear that there is a difference between modern and being contemporary. Modernity lies not just in themes and perspective, but also the approach, the attitudes and articulation of those thoughts and ideas. The term modernism is not an all-inclusive term that describes a homogeneous group, nor is it restricted to a particular period or epoch in literary history. Okay. So, on the contrary, it is a dynamic and evolving concept that encapsulates within it various literary movements like romantic, feminist and so on. The course of Indian literature in the various languages reveals modernist thought both before and after independence and is marked by a self-conscious rendering of the contemporary milieu, a reflection of social mores, an attempt to express opposition or advocate a change from contemporary practices, whether social, literary or political. Okay. So, here it is the main paragraph. The course of Indian literature in the various languages reveal modernist thought both before and after independence, and it is marked by a self-conscious rendering of the contemporary milieu, a reflection of social mores, and an attempt to express opposition or advocate a change from contemporary practices, whether social, literary or political. The development of certain other features in literary thought, perspective and expression has given rise to the term postmodern, and critics are still debating whether the phase of modernism has ended. Okay. The postmodern and critics are still debating whether the phase of modernism has ended. Here it is the unit 10 questions. Do you agree with Joshi and Ray that modernism came to India because of the British and Indians getting to know European ideas, or do you think that modernism would have happened in India even without the arrival of the British? Is the modernity that came with British a unique event, or it is the case that there are many movements of modernity in history as well as in literature? Write your response to Dharwadekkar's view that not all nationalist poets were romantics and that not all romantics were nationalists. Do you agree with Dharwadekkar's thesis that some of the modern poets are traditionalist and classicist? Find examples in your own language of poets or novelists who are both modern and traditional. Dharwadekkar has given the examples of Hindi poet Mahadevi Verma as being modern and traditional. Read the works of writers mentioned in the unit and identify postmodernist features as distinct from the modernist ones. Here is the references and suggested readings. You can read now. Okay. In the next class, I will discuss the unit 2, the center and periphery. Okay. So, please watch the videos till end and you can get a better idea for your IGNOU exam point of view, and you can note down all the points which I have discussed in the videos, and you can note down all these important key points and write down in your own words to score good marks. Okay. Thank you viewers. Please like, share and subscribe this channel. Okay. Thank you.